Some stories begin with a scream, others with a whisper. But this one began with silence. An eerie, haunting silence that stretched across weeks, punctuated only by the soft shuffle of a child's footsteps and the quiet breath of a scarred German shepherd by her side. 6-year-old Leah Thompson had once been a vibrant child, the kind who filled rooms with questions, giggles, and wild stories about princesses and pirates. But after one spring afternoon, that voice vanished, stolen by fear. Everyone around her tried to fix what was broken. But it wasn't until Bruno, a retired police dog with wounds of his own, came into her life that something shifted. What followed was not just a recovery. It was a pursuit of truth, a battle in court, and a bond that defied words. This is their story. It was the kind of spring afternoon that made you believe the world was safe. The breeze was light, the sun painted golden ribbons across freshly mowed lawns, and the scent of lilacs drifted gently through the neighborhood. 6-year-old Leah Thompson twirled across her backyard in a pink dress, arms stretched wide like wings. Her mother, Julia, watched from the kitchen window with a tired but contented smile, debating whether to start dinner or wait until her husband got home. The phone rang, a call from her sister in Colorado. Julia stepped into the next room, telling herself it would only take a minute, just 4 minutes. When she returned, the gate was open. For a moment, her mind refused to register what her eyes saw. Leila was no longer alone. A man knelt beside her, speaking in a tone too soft to hear, but too slick to trust. His van, black, unmarked, idled by the curb, its side door partially open. In that instant, Julia's breath hitched in her throat. Her stomach dropped. The scene didn't make sense, but her body understood before her mind did. Her heart slammed against her ribs. Adrenaline surged through her chest like cold lightning. Sick, primal fear gripped her as her gaze locked on the stranger's hand, inching toward her daughter. "I have puppies in my van," he was saying. "Special ones you want to see?" Julia's scream ripped through the yard. "Leila." The man's head jerked up. The smile vanished. His hand closed around Leia's wrist, fast and practiced. Leia didn't scream. She didn't move. Her wide eyes locked on his face like something deep inside had frozen. Across the street, Martha Bell, a retired nurse walking her terrier, saw it all. Her voice sharp, despite her age, cracked through the "Hey, get away from her." The man hesitated just long enough. Leia pulled free and bolted toward her mother. Julia caught her mid-run, clutching her daughter as the van sped away, tires screeching against the pavement. But Leia didn't cry, didn't say a word. She only buried her face into her mother's shoulder and trembled. After that day, Leah Thompson never spoke again. Not a word, not even a whisper. In the hours following the attempted abduction, the house was filled with the flashing lights of squad cars and the hurried footsteps of investigators. Special Agent Tom Monroe, a veteran in child abduction cases, took the lead. He'd seen patterns like this before, too many times. A black van, a smooth-talking man, a distracted moment. The script never changed, but the endings often did. What troubled Monroe most wasn't the van or the vague eyewitness descriptions. It was Leia. She didn't scream. She didn't flinch. She didn't cry. She simply folded into herself, quiet and unreachable, as if someone had turned off a switch inside her. At the kitchen table, Julia sat clutching a warm cup of untouched coffee, her hands trembling. Ben, her husband, paced the hallway just outside, his jaw clenched, so tight he could barely speak. "She won't even look at me," Julia whispered, staring at her daughter, curled up on the couch, wrapped in a blanket, eyes blank. "It's like she's not here." Julia felt a kind of pain she couldn't name, an ache that lived somewhere deeper than her chest. It wasn't just fear. It was grief for a child who was still physically there but emotionally gone. And worse, it was guilt. Guilt that she hadn't gotten outside sooner, that she hadn't sensed something was wrong, that her baby had come back, but not whole. Pat gently suggested trauma-induced selective mutism, a psychological response to overwhelming fear. But that knowledge didn't make it easier to bear. Over the next few days, Leia stopped doing everything she once loved. Stopped playing, stopped drawing, refused to go outside. Even the sound of a delivery truck would send her diving beneath the bed. At night, she tossed and turned, caught in silent nightmares. No screams, just gasps, sharp, breathless, terrified. The case stalled. There were no fingerprints, no useful surveillance footage, just a scared little girl who couldn't tell them what she'd seen or who. And the longer the silence stretched, the further away justice felt. The recommendation came late one night when Julia sat across from Ben at the kitchen table, her face pale and hollow with exhaustion. Stirred her tea without drinking it, eyes unfocused. The therapist mentioned something today, she said quietly. Thinks maybe a therapy animal. Ben blinked. A dog, she said. It might help rebuild trust, make Leia feel safe again. At this point, I'm willing to try anything. A few days later, they found themselves at Dr. Naomi Green's Animal Therapy Center, a quiet facility nestled at the edge of town. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm fur. Was there they met Bruno. He was a large German shepherd, sitting motionless on a padded mat near the window. His fur was peppered with gray and a long scar ran down his right side, jagged and angry, looking a clear reminder of something violent. His name's Bruno, Dr. Green said gently. He used to be a canine officer. 3 years ago, he was injured during a child rescue mission. Knife wound. He saved the child, but the injury ended his career. They were going to put him down. Julia's heart clenched. But you stopped that. Dr. Green nodded. He still got sharp instincts. And something tells me he has more to give. Leia stood behind her mother, half hidden, staring at the dog. Bruno didn't move. He didn't bark. He simply watched her, eyes steady, calm, no pressure, no judgment. And Leia, she felt something stir in the quiet space between them, something she couldn't explain. There was a heaviness in his eyes that mirrored her own. Not pity, not fear, just understanding. Like he knew what it meant to be hurt and not have the words for it. She didn't know why, but she trusted him. Maybe it was the way he didn't look away. Maybe it was because, like her, he looked like someone who had been left behind. Didn't feel afraid when she looked at him. For the first time in weeks, she felt seen and safe. You don't have to come close, Dr. Green said softly. Just when you're ready. Leia didn't answer. But she didn't walk away either. And somehow that was enough. The first meeting ended with silence, but not the kind that crushed the air from a room. This silence felt different, lighter, like a door had opened just an inch. The next day, Julia brought Leela back. They sat in the same room. Bruno, ever patient, lay in the same spot. He didn't move when they entered, didn't wag his tail or make a sound. He simply acknowledged Leela with a blink, then rested his head back on his paws as if to say, I'm here when you're ready. Dr. Green gave no instructions, offered no expectations. Just time. Leia stood closer that day, just a few feet from him. She didn't speak, but for the first time her fingers twitched ever so slightly at her side, and Bruno noticed. His ears perked, but he remained still. It went on like that for days. Small movements, little shifts, a breath closer, a blink longer. And then, one afternoon, something changed. Leela knelt on the rug, her tiny hand stretched out, trembling but deliberate. Bruno lifted his head. His eyes met hers, steady and firm. He rose slowly, padded forward, and gently pressed his nose into her. The contact was soft, almost accidental, but it broke something open. Leia let out a shaky breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Then, without warning, she wrapped both arms around Bruno's neck and buried her face into his fur. Her shoulders trembled, not with fear, but with the weight of everything she'd been holding in. Julia gasped from across the room, hands flying to her mouth. Her daughter hadn't touched another living thing since the incident. Bruno stood still, quiet and grounded. He didn't move. He didn't need. For the first time since that spring afternoon, Leila had chosen to reach out, not with words, but with trust. And Bruno, he caught her, while Leila and Bruno began the slow work of healing. Agent Tom Monroe hadn't stopped working. The case had stalled for weeks. No fingerprints, no footage, no DNA, just one terrified child who couldn't speak, and a vague eyewitness account from Martha Bell, the elderly neighbor who had seen the man's face for only a second, enough to say he was white, average build, wearing a dark hoodie. Nothing that could hold up in court. But Martha hadn't given up. She'd insisted. She remembered part of the license plate, KYB. The letters came to her late one night as she lay awake going over the moment in her mind. It wasn't much, but it was something. Monroe ran the partial plate through every database he had access to. After days of cross-referencing vehicle registrations and narrowing the search by model and region, one name stood out. Simon Vale, a 44-year-old freelance software engineer, with no criminal record, no family, and an eerie habit of relocating every 6 months. When Monroe pulled his file, something didn't sit right. The man's movements crisscrossed with several other missing child reports. None ever solved. He visited Simon's neighborhood. A quiet man, polite, nothing odd, nothing that screamed predator. But Monroe had seen this before. How normal. Hid the worst kind of monsters. There wasn't enough to make an arrest, but there was enough to dig deeper. Oh. Monroe circled back to Julia. How's Leia doing? He asked gently. Julia hesitated. She's better. She still doesn't talk, but she's not afraid all the time anymore. Not with Bruno around. Monroe's expression shifted. Slightly. Then maybe he said, "We just found our strongest lead." The lead was fragile, but it was enough. Following the plate match and the discovery of Simon Vale's suspicious travel history, Agent Monroe submitted a formal request for surveillance. The more they looked, the more off things became. Vale's vague work history, empty tax records, and a van that matched the one described by Martha Bell to the inch. Still, without physical evidence or a verbal witness, it wasn't enough to indict. That's when Monroe made a bold move. He brought what little they had before a judge to request a pretrial hearing, arguing for probable cause. The courtroom was unnervingly quiet as 6-year-old Leia stepped through the heavy double doors, her hand clutching the leash of Bruno, the scarred German shepherd who never left her side. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if each step forward carried the weight of everything she couldn't say. The polished wood floor echoed beneath her shoes, and every eye in the room followed her, some with sympathy, others with skepticism. Bruno walked beside her in perfect sync, alert but calm. His deep brown eyes scanned the space ahead, tail low and steady. His body language said one thing: "I'm here." Judge Elliot Graves, a seasoned figure on the bench, leaned forward slightly. He didn't speak. He simply watched as Leia made her way toward the front where her mother helped her into the witness chair. Leia's small frame was nearly swallowed by the large wooden seat. Her legs dangled above the floor and her eyes stayed fixed on the polished edge of the table. And then, without warning, she placed one hand on Bruno's back, just resting it there. Her fingers curled into his fur. Bruno remained still, but his ears perked and his muscles tensed. Judge Elliot Graves presided, stern, seasoned, and skeptical of theatrics. The presence of a therapy dog in his courtroom was unusual, but after reading the documentation from Dr. Naomi Green and Leia's therapist, he allowed it. Bruno was more than emotional support. He was Leia's anchor. When Simon Vale entered the room, flanked by his attorney, Leia froze. She didn't cry or flinch, just stared, motionless. Bruno lifted his head, his eyes locked onto Simon's like radar, finding a signal. He didn't growl, didn't bark, but he watched. The defense moved to have the dog removed, calling him prejudicial. The prosecution, led by ADA Rachel Connors, stood firm. "Your Honor, this child has been diagnosed with trauma-induced selective mutism. She cannot communicate like other witnesses, but she can respond through cues through the presence of Bruno." Judge Graves paused, considering. "Motion denied," he said at last. "The dog stays." The trial was only in its preliminary stages. Witnesses would be called. Evidence would be challenged. But that day, in that moment, something undeniable passed between a silent child and a watchful dog. When Leia reached down and touched Bruno's back, his tail thumped once against the floor, soft but certain. And on the other side of the courtroom, for just a flicker of a second, Simon Vale stopped smiling. "Ada." Rachel Connor stepped forward gently, careful not to startle the child. "Leia," she said, her voice like a whisper in the hush. "Do you see the man who came into your yard that day? You don't have to speak. You can just look or Point. Leia didn't respond right away. Then slowly, her gaze lifted and her eyes found Simon Vale. The moment their eyes met, something in her shifted, her breath caught in her throat. Her shoulders tightened, her hands balled into fists. It felt like the air in the room had vanished. The color drained from her face. She wasn't sitting in a courtroom anymore. She was back in her yard. Back in that bright, horrible afternoon. The smell of flowers, the sound of birds, the van, the smile that wasn't kind at all. The hand that gripped her wrist, the voice that promised puppies, and the terror that swallowed her whole. Her eyes filled, but the tears didn't fall. She looked like she might fold into herself all over again. And then Bruno moved. Slowly, silently, the old German shepherd stood and pressed himself against her side. No words, no sounds, just quiet strength. Leela looked down at him. Their eyes met, and in that look she heard him. Not with her ears, but with something deeper, as if he were saying, "I'm right here. You don't have to be afraid anymore. I know what it's like to be hurt, but we don't run. Not this time. Be brave. I'm with you." The fear didn't vanish, but it no longer controlled her. She placed her hand gently on Bruno's head, felt his warmth, his calm. He drew in one long shaky breath, and then she turned. She lifted her hand and pointed. Her voice came next, soft, uncertain, cracking under the weight of silence long held. But it came. "It's him," she whispered. There was a pause. The room didn't move. Then her voice rose, not loud, but steadier. "It's him. He's the one." The words echoed like thunder in the still courtroom. Gasps followed. The stenographer dropped her pen. One juror blinked away tears. Heavy silence settled over the room. Even the air felt still. And on the bench, Julia's hand flew to her mouth. Tears spilled before she even realized. They were coming. It wasn't just relief. It was heartbreak. In her daughter's voice, she heard all the pain Leia had carried in silence. All the nights she couldn't reach her. All the guilt she couldn't name. But now, her little girl had spoken. And somehow that one small sentence made everything hurt and begin to heal. It wasn't just the words. Was the fact that they had come from her, from a child who hadn't spoken in weeks. And all it took was a dog who refused to leave her side. The courtroom emptied slowly that day, but no one forgot what they witnessed. Simon Vale didn't confess. He didn't cry. But as Leela's words echoed through the chambers, something in him cracked, and, for the first time, the weight of his silence was heavier than hers. Leia's testimony stood alone, soft but unshakable. It was enough. In the days that followed, investigators uncovered matching tire tracks, fibers found in Vale's van, and patterns linking him to other unsolved attempts in neighboring counties. Piece by piece, the puzzle closed, and when it did, there was no doubt left. Simon Vale was the man who tried to take Leela. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. But what mattered most didn't make the headlines. It lived in the quiet victory of a little girl who found her voice and the dog who helped her believe it mattered. That night, Julia tucked her daughter into bed. For weeks, this had been the hardest part of the day. Leia would lie, still, wide-eyed, trapped in memories she couldn't share. But this time, Bruno curled up beside her. And this time, just before Julia turned off the light, Isla spoke. "Mom." Julie froze. "Yes, baby." A beat. Then, "Can Bruno stay with me all night?" Julia's throat tightened. She nodded, her voice too full to speak. Leela wrapped her arms around the shepherd's neck, whispering something only he could hear. And as Bruno laid his head beside hers, eyes closing in quiet watch, the house fell into a silence no longer filled with fear. Was the silence of peace, of safety, of something stronger than fear. The voice of a child and the loyalty of a dog finally heard.